Sarah Martinez sat in the back corner of the music room, hoping no one would notice her. She had been doing this for 3 years now. Every time Mrs. Chen asked for volunteers, Sarah would look down at her notebook and pretend to write something important. Every time the teacher called on students to answer questions, Sarah would sink lower in her chair. The music room was not very big. It had 20 old chairs arranged in rows, facing a small stage where Mrs. Chun kept her piano. The walls were covered with pictures of famous musicians and composers. Mozart smiled down from one corner. Beethoven looked serious from another. Sarah knew all their names and their stories, but she never felt brave enough to play their music in front of others. Sarah had been taking piano lessons since she was 7 years old. That was 9 years ago. Her mother had signed her up because she thought it would be good for Sarah to learn something beautiful. Her father had agreed because he thought music might help Sarah become more confident. But after all these years, Sarah still felt scared every time someone asked her to play. She was good at piano. Her teacher, Mr. Rodriguez, always told her she had talent. He said she played with feeling, not just with her fingers, but Sarah did not believe him. When she played alone in her room, the music sounded nice to her. But when other people were around, her hands would shake and she would make mistakes. The other students in music class seemed so different from Sarah. There was Jessica, who sang solos in the school choir and never seemed nervous. There was David, who played guitar and had already performed at 3 school concerts. There was Maria, who played violin and had won a competition last year. All of them raised their hands when Mrs. Chun asked questions. All of them seemed to love being in front of people. Sarah looked at the clock on the wall. It was almost time for Mrs. Chun to make her announcement. Sarah had heard rumors about what was coming. Every spring, the music students had to perform in a recital. Sarah had managed to avoid it for 2 years by being sick or having family trips. But this year, she was a junior. Mrs. Chun had already said that all juniors had to participate. There was no way out. Mrs. Chun walked to the front of the room. She was a small woman with gray hair and kind eyes. She had been teaching music at the school for 15 years. Students loved her because she was patient and never made anyone feel bad about making mistakes. But Sarah was still scared of disappointing her. "Good morning, everyone," Mrs. Chun said with a smile. "I hope you all had a good weekend. Today I want to talk to you about something exciting that happens every spring at our school." Sarah felt her stomach drop. Here it was, the announcement she had been dreading. As many of you know, we have our annual spring recital coming up in 6 weeks. This year, it will be on Friday, April 15th, at 7 in the evening. The recital will be held in the main auditorium, and we expect about 200 people to attend. 200 people. Sarah felt dizzy. She could not imagine playing piano in front of 2 people, let alone 200. Now, I know some of you might be feeling nervous about this, Mrs. Chun continued, looking directly at Sarah for a moment. But I want you to remember that this recital is not about being perfect. It is about sharing your love of music with others. It is about showing how much you have learned and grown this year. Sarah wanted to raise her hand and ask to be excused. She wanted to tell Mrs. Chun that she had a fear of performing. She wanted to explain that her hands shook and her mind went blank when people watched her. But she could not find the courage to speak up. "Each of you will perform one piece," Mrs. Chun said. "You can choose something you already know well, or you can learn something new. The most important thing is that you choose something that means something to you. Music should come from the heart, not just from the fingers." Sarah thought about all the pieces she knew. She had learned dozens of songs over the years. There were easy ones from her beginner books. There were harder ones that had taken her months to master, but none of them felt right for performing in front of 200 strangers. "I will be meeting with each of you individually over the next 2 weeks to discuss your piece choice," Mrs. Chun announced. "We will talk about what you want to play and how we can help you prepare. Remember, I am here to support you, not to judge you." The bell rang and students began packing up their things. Sarah moved slowly, hoping everyone else would leave first. She did not want to walk out with the other students and have to listen to them talk excitedly about what they planned to perform. Jessica was already talking to her friends about a song she wanted to sing. David was discussing a new guitar piece he had been working on. Maria was wondering if she should play something classical or something modern on her violin. They all sounded so confident, so eager to share their music. Sarah finally stood up and gathered her books. As she walked toward the door, Mrs. Chun called her name. "Sarah, could you stay for just a moment?" Sarah felt her cheeks turn red. Had Mrs. Chun noticed how scared she looked? Was she going to ask her about the recital? Sarah nodded and walked over to the piano where Mrs. Chun was standing. "I wanted to check in with you about the recital," Mrs. Chun said gently. "I know performing can feel scary, especially when it is something new. How are you feeling about it?" Sarah looked down at her shoes. They were old sneakers that her mother had bought her at the beginning of the school year. They were comfortable, but they were not very pretty. Everything about Sarah felt ordinary and not worth noticing. "I am nervous," Sarah admitted quietly. "I do not like playing in front of people. I always make mistakes when people are watching." Mrs. Chun nodded understandingly. "That is very normal, Sarah. Even professional musicians get nervous before they perform. The key is to find music that you connect with so strongly that you forget about the audience." Sarah looked up at her teacher. "But what if I freeze up? What if I forget everything?" "Then you take a deep breath and start again," Mrs. Chun said with a warm smile. "The audience is not there to judge you. They are there to enjoy music. And I have heard you play during our practice sessions. You have a beautiful touch on the piano. You just need to trust yourself." Sarah wanted to believe her teacher, but doubt filled her mind. She had never felt beautiful or confident about anything, especially not her piano playing. "Think about it over the next few days," Mrs. Chun said. "We will meet next Tuesday to discuss what piece you might want to work. And remember, I will be right there with you every step of the way." Sarah nodded and walked out of the music room. The hallway was crowded with students heading to their next classes. Sarah felt invisible among them, which was exactly how she liked it. Being invisible meant being safe. Being invisible meant not having to worry about making mistakes in front of people, but now, for the first time in her life, Sarah was going to have to step into the light. She was going to have to sit at a piano in front of 200 people and play music. The thought terrified her, but there was no way around it. As she walked to her next class, Sarah wondered if 6 weeks would be enough time to find the courage she had been missing her whole life. Tuesday came too quickly for Sarah. She had spent the entire weekend thinking about her meeting with Mrs. Chun. She had tried to practice piano at home, but every time she sat down to play, she could only think about the recital. Her fingers felt stiff and her mind kept wandering to images of herself sitting on stage in front of hundreds of people. Sarah's mother had noticed her daughter's worry. On Sunday evening, she had sat down next to Sarah at the kitchen table while Sarah picked at her dinner. "You seem upset about something, honey," her mother had said. "Is everything okay at school?" Sarah had told her mother about the recital. Her mother had smiled and said she was excited to hear Sarah play. But Sarah could see the concern in her mother's eyes. Her mother knew how shy Sarah was. She knew how hard it was for Sarah to speak up in class or make new friends. "Maybe this will be good for you," her mother had said gently. "Maybe this will help you see how talented you really are." But Sarah did not feel talented. She felt scared and small and completely unprepared for what was coming. Now it was Tuesday afternoon, and Sarah was walking slowly toward the music room. She had been dreading this moment all day. During lunch, she had barely eaten anything. During math class, she had not been able to focus on the lesson. All she could think about was this meeting with Mrs. Chun. The music room was empty when Sarah arrived. Mrs. Chun was sitting at the piano, playing something soft and beautiful. Sarah recognized the melody, but she could not remember the name of the piece. She stood in the doorway for a moment, listening. Mrs. Chun looked up and smiled. "Sarah, come in. I was just warming up a little bit. How are you feeling today?" Sarah walked into the room and sat down in the chair closest to the piano. I am okay, she said, but her voice was quiet and uncertain. Have you had a chance to think about what you might want to play for the recital? Mrs. Chun asked. Sarah shook her head. I tried to think about it, but I do not know what would be good. Everything I know seems too easy or too hard. Mrs. Chun nodded understandingly. That is a common problem. Sometimes when we think too much about what other people will think, it becomes hard to choose anything at all. Sarah looked down at her hands. Her fingernails were bitten short, a habit she had developed when she was nervous. I am just worried that whatever I play will not be good enough. The other students are so much better than me. Sarah, can I tell you something? Mrs. Chun said, moving her chair closer. I have been teaching music for 15 years. In that time, I have heard thousands of students play. Some of them were very technical and could play the most difficult pieces perfectly. But the performances that I remember most, the ones that really moved me, were not always the most technically perfect ones. Sarah looked up at her teacher, curious despite her nervousness. The performances I remember most were the ones where the student really connected with the music, Mrs. Chun continued. Where they played with their heart, not just with their fingers. And Sarah, when I hear you play during our practice sessions, when you think no one is listening, that is exactly what you do. Sarah felt confused. But I make so many mistakes when I practice. Mistakes can be fixed, Mrs. Chun said. But the feeling you put into your music, that cannot be taught. That comes from inside you. Mrs. Chun stood up and walked over to a shelf, full of music books. She pulled out a thin book with a blue cover and brought it back to the piano. I have an idea, she said, opening the book. There is a piece here that I think would be perfect for you. It is not the most difficult piece in the world, but it is beautiful and meaningful. Sarah looked at the page Mrs. Chun was showing her. At the top, in fancy letters, were the words Für Elise by Ludwig van Beethoven. Sarah's heart sank a little. But Mrs. Chun, I already know this piece. I learned it when I was in 8th grade. It is too easy, Mrs. Chun smiled. That is exactly why it is perfect. You already know the notes, so you can focus on the music instead of worrying about technique. And Sarah, this piece may seem simple, but it is one of the most beloved pieces of classical music ever written. There is a reason why people have been playing it and loving it for more than 200 years. Sarah looked at the music again. She did know this piece well. She had learned it 3 years ago and had played it many times since then. It was one of the first pieces that had made her feel like a real pianist, but she had always thought of it as a beginner piece, something that serious musicians had moved beyond. I know what you are thinking, Mrs. Chun said. You think this piece is too simple, too basic. But let me ask you something. When you play this piece at home, how does it make you feel? Sarah thought about it. When she played Für Elise in her bedroom, she always felt calm and peaceful. The gentle melody reminded her of something, though she could never quite remember what. It was like a half-forgotten memory that lived somewhere in her heart. It makes me feel ... Sarah paused, trying to find the right words. It makes me feel safe, I guess, like I'm remembering something nice. Mrs. Chun nodded. That is exactly what I mean. This piece speaks to you. It means something to you. And that is what will make your performance special. Sarah picked up the sheet music and looked at it more carefully. The notes were familiar, like old friends she had not seen in a while. She could imagine her fingers moving across the keys, playing the gentle opening melody. But what if people think it is too easy? Sarah asked. What if they expect something more impressive? Sarah, can I tell you a secret? Mrs. Chun said, leaning in closer. The best musicians in the world, the ones who perform in the greatest concert halls, they still play this piece. They play it because it is beautiful, not because it is difficult. Music is not about showing off. It is about sharing something meaningful with other people. Sarah felt a small spark of hope. Maybe Mrs. Chun was right. Maybe she did not need to play the hardest piece she could find. Maybe she just needed to play something that mattered to her. Will you try it? Mrs. Chun asked. Will you play through it once just to see how it feels? Sarah nodded and moved to the piano bench. She placed her fingers on the keys and took a deep breath. Then she began to play the opening notes of Für Elise. The melody flowed from her fingers easily, naturally. She had played this piece so many times that her hands remembered exactly where to go. But as she played, something felt different. Instead of just playing the notes, she found herself listening to the music, really listening to it. The piece began gently, almost like a question being asked. Then it moved into a more passionate section, like someone telling an important story. Finally, it returned to the gentle opening theme. Like the answer to the original question, as Sarah played the final notes, she realized that tears were forming in her eyes. She had never noticed before how beautiful this piece really was. She had been so focused on learning harder and more impressive music that she had forgotten why she had fallen in love with this simple melody in the first place. "That was lovely, Sarah," Mrs. Chun said softly. "How did that feel? It felt ... Sarah paused, trying to understand her own emotions. "It felt like coming home ... double quotes." Mrs. Chun smiled. "Then I think we have found your piece." Sarah looked at the sheet music again. The notes seemed friendlier now, more welcoming. This was not just a simple piece that beginners played. This was a piece of music that had touched millions of people over the centuries. And now, maybe it could help Sarah touch the hearts of the people who would be listening to her at the recital. "Are you sure this will be okay?" Sarah asked. "Are you sure people will not think it is too basic?" "Sarah, let me tell you something about this piece," Mrs. Chun said. "Beethoven wrote it for someone very special to him. He poured his heart into every note. When you play it with feeling, when you play it with meaning, it becomes one of the most powerful pieces of music ever written." Sarah felt a warmth spreading through her chest. For the first time since Mrs. Chun had announced the recital, Sarah felt like maybe, just maybe, she could do this. "Okay," Sarah said quietly. "I will play Für Elise." Mrs. Chun smiled and patted Sarah's shoulder. "We will work on it together. We will make sure you feel confident and prepared. And Sarah, I want you to remember something. You are not performing to impress anyone. You are performing to share something beautiful. That is what music is really about." As Sarah packed up her things and prepared to leave the music room, she felt lighter than she had in days. She still felt nervous about the recital, but now she also felt something else. She felt excited. For the first time in her life, she was going to share her music with the world, and she was going to do it with a piece that felt like home. That evening, Sarah sat at the old piano in her family's living room. The piano had been there for as long as she could remember. It was not a fancy piano, just a simple upright with keys that were slightly yellow from age. But it had been her companion for 9 years, and she loved it more than any other piece of furniture in the house. Sarah opened her music book to Für Elise and placed it on the music stand. She had played this piece hundreds of times before, but tonight felt different. Tonight she was not just practicing. She was preparing to share this music with other people. The thought still scared her, but it also made her want to play the piece better than she had ever played it before. She began with the gentle opening notes. Da 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 da. The melody was so familiar that she could play it with her eyes closed. But as her fingers moved across the keys, something strange happened. A memory began to form in her mind. She was 8 years old again, standing in her grandmother's small kitchen. The kitchen always smelled like fresh bread and cinnamon. Her grandmother, Abuela Rosa, was standing at the stove, stirring something in a large pot, and she was humming. She was humming the exact melody that Sarah was now playing on the piano. Sarah stopped playing and sat very still. How had she forgotten that? Her grandmother had hummed Für Elise all the time. When she cooked, when she cleaned, when she worked in her small garden behind the house. It had been like her personal song, the melody that followed her through her daily life. Sarah's eyes filled with tears as more memories came flooding back. She remembered sitting at her grandmother's kitchen table, doing homework while Abuela Rosa prepared dinner. The soft humming would fill the room, making even the most difficult math problems seem manageable. She remembered helping her grandmother Baked cookies for church fundraisers, both of them covered in flour. While that gentle melody danced through the air, Abuela Rosa had died 6 months ago. It had been sudden and unexpected. One day she was fine, telling stories and laughing with the family. The next day she was gone. Sarah had been devastated. Her grandmother had been her closest friend, the person who always believed in her when she did not believe in herself. Sarah wiped her eyes and began playing again. This time, as the notes filled the room, she could almost hear her grandmother's voice humming along. She could almost smell the bread baking in the oven. She could almost feel her grandmother's gentle hand patting her shoulder when she was sad or worried. The music sounded different now. It was not just a collection of notes anymore. It was a connection to someone she loved and missed more than anything in the world. Every phrase reminded her of a moment they had shared together. Every melody brought back the warmth and safety she had felt in her grandmother's presence. Sarah's mother appeared in the doorway of the living room. She had been washing dishes in the kitchen, but the sound of the piano had drawn her in. She stood quietly, listening to her daughter play. "That's beautiful, honey," her mother said when Sarah finished the piece. "I haven't heard you play with so much feeling in a long time." Sarah turned to look at her mother. "Mom, do you remember how Abuela Rosa used to hum this song?" Her mother's face softened. "Of course I do. She hummed it every day. Your father and I used to joke that it was her theme song." "I had forgotten," Sarah said quietly. "I don't know how I could have forgotten something so important." Her mother came and sat down next to Sarah on the piano bench. "Sometimes when we lose someone we love, our minds protect us by hiding some of the memories for a while. But they come back when we're ready for them?" Sarah looked down at the sheet music. "Mrs. Chen wants me to play this piece at the recital. I thought it was too simple, but now you realize it's perfect," her mother finished. "Your grandmother would have loved to hear you play her favorite song in front of all those people." Sarah felt a warmth spreading through her chest. For the first time since learning about the recital, she felt like she had a real reason to perform. She was not just playing music anymore. She was honoring her grandmother's memory. She was sharing a piece of Abuela Rosa with the world. "Tell me more about why she loved this song," Sarah asked. Her mother smiled, lost in her own memories. "She told me once that she had learned to hum it when she was a young girl in Mexico. Her own grandmother had taught it to her, though I don't think either of them knew it was written by Beethoven. To them, it was just a beautiful melody that got passed down through the family." Sarah's eyes widened. "So Abuela Rosa learned it from her grandmother too?" "That's right. And her grandmother probably learned it from someone else. This little melody has been traveling through our family for generations, bringing comfort and joy wherever it goes." Sarah felt goosebumps on her arms. She was not just playing a piece of classical music. She was continuing a family tradition that stretched back decades, maybe even longer. She was the next link in a chain of women who had found beauty and meaning in this simple melody. "Do you think," Sarah asked hesitantly, "do you think Abuela Rosa would be proud of me for playing this at the recital?" Her mother wrapped her arm around Sarah's shoulders. "Honey, your grandmother was already proud of you for so many things. But yes, I think she would be absolutely thrilled to know that you're sharing her favorite song with the world." Sarah felt tears in her eyes again, but this time they were not tears of sadness. They were tears of connection, of purpose, of love that reached across time and death to give her strength. She began playing the piece again, and this time her mother hummed along softly. The sound brought back even more memories. Sunday dinners at Abuela Rosa's house, with the whole family gathered around her small table. Birthday parties where her grandmother would hum while she lit the candles on the cake. Quiet afternoons when Sarah was sick and her grandmother would sit by her bed, humming softly until Sarah fell asleep. As Sarah played, she began to understand the piece in a completely new way. The gentle opening was like her grandmother's morning greeting, soft and loving. The more passionate middle section was like the stories her grandmother would tell about her youth in Mexico, full of adventure and emotion. And the return to the gentle theme at the end was like her grandmother's goodnight kiss, peaceful and comforting. You know, her mother said when Sarah finished playing, your grandmother always said that music was the language of the heart. She said that when words weren't enough, music could say what needed to be said. Sarah nodded. She understood now why Mrs. Chun had chosen this piece for her. It was not about playing something impressive or difficult. It was about playing something that came from her heart, something that meant something real and important. To her, over the next few days, Sarah found herself thinking about her grandmother constantly. She remembered the way Abuela Rosa would encourage her when she was struggling with piano lessons. "Don't worry about the mistakes, Mia," she would say. "Just play with love. That's all that matters." She remembered how her grandmother would clap enthusiastically whenever Sarah played for her, even if the performance was full of errors. "Beautiful, beautiful," she would say. "You have music in your soul." Sarah had always thought her grandmother was just being kind, just being a loving grandmother who wanted to make her feel good. But now she wondered if maybe her grandmother had seen something in her music that she had not seen in herself. The more Sarah practiced Für Elise, the more she felt her grandmother's presence with her. Sometimes, when she played particularly beautifully, she could almost hear her grandmother's voice saying, "See, Mia, that's it. That's the music of your heart." Sarah began to look forward to her practice sessions in a way she never had before. She was not just preparing for a recital anymore. She was spending time with her grandmother, having conversations through music, sharing memories that lived in every note. One evening, as she was playing through the piece, Sarah's father stopped in the doorway of the living room. He had never been particularly musical, but he stood and listened with tears in his eyes. "It's like she's here again," he said quietly when Sarah finished. "It's like Rosa is right here in the room with us." Sarah felt a deep sense of peace wash over her. This was what Mrs. Chin had meant when she talked about playing with feeling. This was what it meant to connect with music on a personal level. She was not just playing notes on a page. She was channeling love, memory, and family history through her fingers and into the world. For the first time since learning about the recital, Sarah felt truly excited to perform. She had something important to share now. She had a story to tell, a person to honor, a tradition to continue, and she knew that when she sat down at the piano in front of all those people, she would not be alone. Her grandmother would be there with her, humming along softly, reminding her to play with love and not worry about anything else. The piece that had once seemed too simple now felt like the most important music she had ever learned. It was her grandmother's gift to her, and soon it would be her gift to everyone who listened. 2 weeks had passed since Sarah's meeting with Mrs. Chun, and her daily practice sessions had become something entirely different from what they used to be. Instead of rushing through scales and exercises, Sarah found herself spending most of her time with Für Elise. Each day, she discovered something new in the music that she had never noticed before. It was a rainy Thursday afternoon when the biggest discovery happened. Sarah had come home from school feeling emotionally drained. It had been one of those days when everything seemed to go wrong. She had failed a math quiz, spilled soup on her favorite sweater at lunch, and overheard some classmates talking about how nervous she always looked in music class. Sarah sat down at the piano feeling defeated. She was supposed to practice for 30 minutes, as she did every day, but she was not sure she had the energy. She opened her music book to Für Elise and began playing, but her heart was not in it. The notes felt mechanical and empty, halfway through the piece. Sarah stopped. This was not how the music was supposed to feel. This was not how her grandmother had hummed it. When Abuela Rosa hummed this melody, it had been full of life and warmth and meaning. But right now, Sarah was just playing notes on a page. Sarah closed her eyes and tried to remember her grandmother more clearly. She thought about the way Abuela Rosa had moved through her small house, always busy but never hurried. She thought about the way her grandmother's face would light up when she saw Sarah walk through the door. She thought about the way her grandmother had faced every challenge in her life with grace and strength. When Sarah opened her eyes and began playing again, something magical happened. Instead of just playing the melody, she began to hear the story that the music was telling. The piece began with a gentle, almost hesitant theme. As Sarah played it, she thought about her grandmother as a young girl in Mexico, shy and uncertain about what the future would hold. The melody seemed to ask a question, what will my life become? Then the music shifted into a more dramatic, passionate section. The notes became urgent and powerful, speaking of dreams and struggles and determination. Sarah thought about her grandmother's journey from Mexico to the United States, about the courage it must have taken to leave everything familiar behind and start a new life in a strange country. As Sarah played this section, she felt the music, expressing all the emotions her grandmother must have experienced. There was longing for the home she had left behind. There was fear about the unknown future ahead. But there was also hope and excitement and an unshakable belief that somehow everything would work out. The passionate section built to a climax and then began to calm down, leading back to the gentle opening theme. But when the original melody returned, it sounded different. It was the same notes, but they carried new meaning now. They were no longer asking a question. They were providing an answer. This is what my life became. This is the peace I found. This is the love I built. As Sarah played the final, quiet notes, tears streamed down her cheeks. She had never understood before that this simple piece was actually telling a complete story. It was a story about life's journey, about facing uncertainty with courage, about finding peace and love even after struggle and hardship. It was her grandmother's story. But it was also, Sarah realized, the story of every person who had ever faced challenges and found a way to overcome them. No wonder this piece had been beloved for over 200 years. It spoke to something universal in the human experience. Sarah played through the piece again, and this time she felt every emotion even more deeply. When she reached the passionate middle section, she thought not just about her grandmother's journey to America, but about all the struggles Abuela Rosa had faced in her life. The death of her husband when Sarah's mother was just a teenager, the years of working 2 jobs to support her children, the loneliness she must have felt when all her children grew up and moved away. But the music also spoke of joy. Sarah thought about her grandmother's wedding day, about the birth of her children, about quiet Sunday mornings when the whole family would gather at her house for breakfast. She thought about her grandmother's garden, where she grew tomatoes and herbs and flowers that filled the yard with color and fragrance. As the melody returned to its gentle conclusion, Sarah understood that her grandmother had lived a complete life. She had experienced sadness and joy, struggle and triumph, loneliness and love. And somehow, through it all, she had maintained the gentle, peaceful spirit that Sarah remembered so well. Sarah's mother found her still sitting at the piano. 20 minutes later, tears drying on her cheeks. "Sarah, honey, are you okay?" her mother asked, concerned. Sarah turned to look at her mother, her eyes bright with understanding. "Mom, I think I finally understand what this piece is really about." Her mother sat down in the chair next to the piano. "Tell me." "It's about Abuela Rosa's whole life," Sarah said, her voice filled with wonder. "The beginning is like when she was young and didn't know what would happen to her. The middle part is about all the hard things she went through, all the challenges she faced. And the end is about the peace she found, the family she built, the love she gave to all of us." Her mother's eyes filled with tears. "Oh, Sarah, that's beautiful. But it's not just about her," Sarah continued. "It's about everyone. It's about how life is sometimes gentle and sometimes difficult. But if you keep going, if you don't give up, you can find your way to peace and love." Sarah's mother reached over and squeezed her daughter's hand. "Your grandmother would be so proud to hear you talk about her music this way." Over the next few days, Sarah's practice sessions became even more meaningful. Every time she sat down to play for Elise, she felt like she was having a conversation with her grandmother. She would play the gentle opening and imagine her grandmother as a young girl, full of dreams and hopes. She would play the dramatic middle section and feel her grandmother's strength and determination. She would play the peaceful ending and feel wrapped in her grandmother's love. Sarah also began to notice technical details in the music that she had never paid attention to before. The way Beethoven used dynamics to tell the story, making some sections soft and others loud. The way he used rhythm to create tension and release. The way he used harmony to create different emotions. But most importantly, Sarah began to understand that technique was not separate from emotion. The technical aspects of the music were tools that helped tell the story. When she played softly, it was not just because the music said piano. It was because the story called for gentleness. When she played loudly, it was not just because the music said forte. It was because the story called for passion and strength. Sarah started looking forward to her weekly lessons with Mr. Rodriguez in a new way. Instead of just wanting to play the notes correctly, she wanted to share the story she had discovered. When she played for him, he noticed the difference immediately. "Sarah, what has happened to your playing?" he asked after she finished the piece. "This is the most musical I have ever heard you play." Sarah told him about her grandmother, about the memories that had come flooding back, about the stories she heard in the music. Mr. Rodriguez listened with tears in his eyes. "This is what I have been trying to teach you for years," he said. "Music is not about perfect technique. It is about communication. It is about sharing something from your heart with other people. And now you have found your voice." As the recital approached, Sarah felt her confidence growing day by day. She was no longer worried about making mistakes or impressing the audience. She had something important to share, and she knew that her grandmother would be with her every step of the way. The piece that had once seemed too simple now felt like the most sophisticated music she had ever played. She understood that true sophistication did not come from complexity. It came from depth of feeling, from personal connection, from the ability to find universal meaning in simple beauty. Sarah had learned that Für Elise was not just a beginner's piece that students played and then moved beyond. It was a masterpiece that revealed new layers of meaning every time you returned to it. And now, finally, Sarah felt ready to share those layers of meaning with the world. Every time she played the piece, she felt her grandmother's presence more strongly. Sometimes, in the quiet moments after she finished playing, Sarah could almost hear her grandmother's voice saying, "See, Mia, now you understand. Now you are ready to share your heart with the world." Thursday evening arrived with a sense of finality that made Sarah's stomach flutter with nervousness. Tomorrow night was the recital. After 6 weeks of preparation, after discovering the deep connection between Für Elise and her grandmother's memory, after finding new meaning in every phrase of the music, tomorrow night she would finally share it all with an audience of 200 people. Sarah sat at her bedroom desk, trying to focus on her history homework, but her mind kept wandering to the recital. She had been feeling confident about her piece for weeks now, but suddenly all her old fears were coming back. What if she forgot the music? What if her hands shook so badly that she could not play? What if the audience thought her piece was too simple compared to what the other students were performing? Unable to concentrate on homework, Sarah closed her textbook and walked downstairs to the living room. She needed to practice one more time to make sure everything was perfect. But as she sat down at the piano, she made a mistake she had not made in weeks. She played the wrong note in the third measure, and the sound seemed to echo through the room like a warning. Sarah tried again, but now she was thinking too much about not making mistakes. Her hands felt stiff and awkward. The music that had flowed so naturally for weeks now seemed forced and mechanical. Panic began to rise in her chest. "This is exactly what I was afraid of," Sarah whispered to herself. "I'm going to mess everything up." She tried playing the piece a third time, but made even more mistakes. Frustrated and scared, Sarah slammed her hands down on the keys, creating a harsh, discordant sound that made her wince. "I can't do this," she said out loud. "I'm not ready. I'm going to embarrass myself in front of everyone." Sarah's mother appeared in the doorway, drawn by the sound of the piano and her daughter's distressed voice. "What's wrong, honey?" her mother asked, sitting down next to Sarah on the piano bench. "I keep making mistakes," Sarah said, her voice shaking. "I was playing this piece perfectly for weeks, and now suddenly I can't get through it without messing up. What if this happens tomorrow night? What if I freeze up in front of all those people?" Her mother put her arm around Sarah's shoulders. "You're just nervous. That's completely normal. Even professional musicians get nervous before big performances." "But what if being nervous makes me forget everything?" Sarah asked. "What if I sit down at the piano tomorrow night and my mind just goes blank?" Sarah's mother was quiet for a moment, thinking. Then she said, "Tell me about your grandmother. Tell me about the memories that come back when you play this piece." Sarah looked at her mother in confusion. "What do you mean? When you play Fur?" "Elise, what do you think about? What do you see in your mind?" Sarah closed her eyes and thought about it. "I see Abuela Rosa in her kitchen, humming while she cooks. I see her hands, always moving, always busy with something. I remember how safe I felt when I was with her." "And how does that make you feel?" her mother asked gently. "It makes me feel peaceful, like I'm connected to something bigger than myself. Like I'm part of a long line of women who have found comfort in this music." Her mother smiled. "That's, what you need to focus on tomorrow night. Not the notes, not the technique, not what other people might think. Just focus on that feeling of connection. Focus on sharing your grandmother's memory with the audience." Sarah opened her eyes and looked at her mother. "But what if I still make mistakes?" "Then you make mistakes," her mother said simply. "Your grandmother never expected perfection from you. She just wanted you to play with love. And that's all the audience wants too. They want to hear music that comes from the heart." Sarah felt some of her panic beginning to fade. Her mother was right. She had been so focused on playing perfectly that she had forgotten why she was playing in the first place. This performance was not about impressing anyone. It was about honoring her grandmother's memory and sharing something beautiful with other people. "Can I tell you something?" her mother said. "Your grandmother used to say that mistakes were just the music's way of showing that a real person was playing it. She said that perfect music was cold music, but music with heart was warm, even if it had a few wrong notes." Sarah smiled for the first time that evening. "That sounded exactly like something Abuela Rosa would say. Do you want to try playing the piece again?" her mother asked. "But this time, don't think about the notes. Just think about your grandmother." Sarah nodded and placed her hands on the keys. She closed her eyes and imagined herself in her grandmother's kitchen. She could smell the bread baking in the oven. She could hear her grandmother's gentle humming. She could feel the warmth and love that had always surrounded her when she was in that small, cozy room. When Sarah began to play, the music flowed naturally again. She was not thinking about finger positions or timing or dynamics. She was just sharing a memory, telling a story, honoring someone she loved. When she finished the piece, both she and her mother had tears in their eyes. "That was beautiful, honey," her mother said. "That's the performance your grandmother would want to hear." But even after this reassuring conversation with her mother, Sarah still felt anxious as she got ready for bed. She lay in the darkness, staring at the ceiling, imagining all the things that could go wrong at the recital. She pictured herself sitting at the piano, her mind blank, her hands frozen. She imagined the audience whispering about how unprepared she seemed. Unable to sleep, Sarah got up and went to her computer. She decided to look up videos of other people playing Fur Elise, thinking that maybe hearing the piece performed by others would help her feel more confident about her own interpretation. The first video she found was of a young pianist about her own age playing at what looked like a student recital. The girl played the piece flawlessly, with perfect technique and precise timing. Sarah felt her confidence plummet. This girl made it look so easy, so effortless. Sarah knew she could never play with that level of technical perfection. The next video was of a famous concert pianist performing the piece in a grand concert hall. Again, the performance was technically perfect, but it was also grand and dramatic in a way that made Sarah feel small and inadequate. How could her simple, emotional interpretation compete with such virtuosity? Sarah found herself going down a rabbit hole of videos, each one making her feel worse about her own abilities. There were young prodigies who played the piece with incredible speed and precision. There were mature artists who brought sophisticated interpretation to every phrase. There were musicians who made the simple melody sound complex and important. By the time Sarah finally closed her laptop, she felt completely defeated. Her version of For Elise seemed so ordinary compared to what she had just heard. Her emotional connection to the piece, which had seemed so important and meaningful to her, now felt naive and amateurish. Sarah crawled back into bed, but sleep was even more elusive now. She kept thinking about all those perfect performances she had watched. She kept comparing herself to those confident, talented musicians and finding herself lacking. At 2 in the morning, Sarah was still awake, her mind racing with worry. Finally, she got up and tiptoed downstairs to the living room. She sat down at the piano and very quietly began to play For Elise. As the familiar melody filled the quiet house, something shifted in Sarah's mind. This was not the technically perfect version she had heard in the videos. This was not the grand, dramatic interpretation of the concert pianist. This was her version, filled with her memories, her love, her connection to her grandmother, and suddenly Sarah realized that was exactly what made it special. Those other musicians might be more technically skilled, but they had not lived in her grandmother's kitchen. They had not been comforted by this melody during childhood illnesses. They had not discovered that this piece told the story of their family's journey through generations. Sarah's version of For Elise was unique because it was hers. It carried her story, her emotions, her personal history. And that was something that no amount of technical perfection could replace. As Sarah played through the piece one more time in the quiet darkness, she felt her grandmother's presence more strongly than ever. She could almost hear Abuela Rosa's voice saying, "Don't worry about what other people can do, Mia. Just focus on what you can do. Just share your heart." When Sarah finally went back to bed, she felt calmer. Tomorrow night would be challenging and she might make mistakes, but she would be sharing something real and meaningful. She would be honoring her grandmother's memory and continuing a family tradition. And that was more important than playing every note perfectly. As she drifted off to sleep, Sarah imagined her grandmother sitting in the audience tomorrow night, humming along softly, proud of her granddaughter for finding the courage to share her heart with the world. Friday arrived with an unusual brightness, as if the universe itself was preparing for something special. Sarah woke up earlier than usual, her stomach already fluttering with nervous anticipation. Today was the day. Tonight she would sit at a piano in front of 200 people and share the music that had become so precious to her. The morning passed in a blur of ordinary activities that felt anything but ordinary. Sarah ate breakfast without really tasting it. She went through her classes without really hearing the lessons. Her friends noticed her distraction and wished her luck for the evening, but their voices seemed to come from far away. During lunch, Sarah found herself sitting alone in the music room, staring at the piano where she had first played For Elise for Mrs. Chun 6 weeks ago. It seemed impossible that so much had changed since then. She had gone from seeing the piece as too simple to understanding it as profoundly meaningful. She had discovered connections to her grandmother that she never knew existed. She had learned that the most powerful music often came from the heart, not from technical complexity. Mrs. Chun found her there, lost in thought. "How are you feeling about tonight?" Mrs. Chun asked, sitting down next to Sarah. "Nervous," Sarah admitted, but also excited. "I never thought I would say that about performing in front of people." Mrs. Chun smiled. "That's exactly how you should feel. The nervousness shows that this matters to you. The excitement shows that you have something important to share." "Mrs. Chun," Sarah said hesitantly, "what if I make mistakes tonight? What if I disappoint everyone?" "Sarah, let me tell you something I learned many years ago," Mrs. Chun said. "The audience is not your enemy. They are not sitting there hoping you will fail. They are sitting there hoping you will succeed. They want to be moved by your music. They want to feel something beautiful. And if you play with your heart, if you share your connection to this piece, they will feel it too." Sarah nodded, trying to absorb this wisdom. It was hard to imagine the audience as friendly when they seemed so intimidating in her mind. "Remember," Mrs. Chun continued, "you are not performing for yourself. You are performing for your grandmother. You are performing to honor her memory and share her love of this music. When you think about it that way, does it feel different? Sarah thought about it and realized that it did feel different. When she imagined playing for her grandmother, the performance felt like a gift rather than a test. It felt like an act of love rather than an audition. The school day finally ended, and Sarah went home to rest before the evening performance. Her mother had taken the afternoon off work to help her prepare. She had pressed Sarah's best dress, a simple black dress that Sarah had worn to her grandmother's funeral 6 months ago. It seemed fitting to wear it tonight. Another way of honoring Abuela Rosa's memory. As evening approached, Sarah's family began getting ready to leave for the recital. Her father put on his best suit, the one he usually saved for weddings and important occasions. Her mother wore the pearl necklace that Abuela Rosa had given her years ago. They were treating this evening as the special event it was. "Are you ready, Mia?" Her father asked, using the same affectionate term that Abuela Rosa had always used. Sarah nodded, though her hands were trembling slightly. She picked up her sheet music, even though she had memorized the piece completely. Having the music with her felt like carrying a security blanket. The drive to school was quiet. Sarah's parents seemed to understand that she needed time to collect her thoughts. Sarah stared out the window at the familiar streets of her neighborhood, trying to calm her racing heart. When they arrived at the school, the parking lot was already full of cars. Sarah could see families walking toward the main entrance, many of them carrying flowers for their young performers. The sight made Sarah's nervousness spike again. All those people would soon be sitting in the auditorium, watching her play. Inside the school, Sarah made her way to the backstage area where the student performers were gathering. The atmosphere was electric with nervous energy. Some students were practicing scales on a small keyboard that had been set up in the corner. Others were doing vocal warm-ups or reviewing their sheet music one last time. Sarah found a quiet corner and sat down, trying to center herself. She closed her eyes and thought about her grandmother. In her mind, she could see Abuela Rosa's gentle face, her warm smile, her encouraging eyes. She could hear her grandmother's voice saying, "Just play with love, Mia. That's all that matters." Sarah. "Martinez?" A voice called her name. One of the older students, who was helping with backstage organization, was looking at her with a clipboard. "You're number 7 on the program. You'll go on in about 40 minutes. 40 minutes. Sarah felt her stomach drop. The time that had seemed so far away was suddenly very real and very close. She looked around at the other students and was struck by how confident many of them appeared. Jessica was warming up her voice, hitting high notes with ease. David was running through scales on his guitar, his fingers moving effortlessly across the strings. Maria was tuning her violin with the practiced ease of someone who had performed many times before. For a moment, Sarah felt out of place among these experienced performers. Her piece was so simple compared to what the others were preparing. Jessica was singing an aria from an opera. Dave was playing a complex finger-picking arrangement of a popular song. Maria was performing a challenging violin concerto. But then Sarah remembered what Mrs. Chen had said about music coming from the heart. She remembered the story her piece told, the memories it carried, the love it represented. She might not be playing the most technically difficult piece in the program, but she was playing the piece that meant the most to her. Sarah could hear the sound of applause from the auditorium as the first student finished their performance. The recital had begun. One by one, students were called to take the stage. Sarah watched from the wings as each performer walked out into the bright lights, sat down at their instrument, and shared their music with the audience. Some performances went perfectly. Others had small mistakes that the performers recovered from gracefully. The audience applauded warmly for each student, just as Mrs. Chun had predicted. They were not sitting in judgment. They were sitting in appreciation of young people sharing their talents. When the 6th performer finished and walked off stage, Sarah knew her time had come. Her heart was pounding so hard she was sure everyone could hear it. Her hands felt cold and slightly damp. Her mouth was dry. "Sarah Martinez, you're up." the stage manager whispered. Sarah stood up on shaking legs. This was it. After 6 weeks of preparation, after discovering the deep meaning in her grandmother's favorite melody, after learning to play with her heart instead of just her fingers, it was time to share it all with the world. As she walked toward the stage entrance, Sarah felt a moment of pure panic. What if she forgot everything? What if her hands froze? What if she disappointed everyone who believed in her? But then, just as she was about to step onto the stage, Sarah felt a presence beside her. It was not visible, not audible, but it was unmistakably real. Her grandmother was there with her, just as she had promised herself she would be. Sarah could almost hear Abuela Rosa's voice, calm and loving. I'm right here with you, Mia. We're going to share our song together. With her grandmother's spirit beside her, Sarah stepped out onto the stage. The lights were bright, and she could see the shadowy forms of 200 people sitting in the darkness beyond. But instead of feeling scared, Sarah felt surrounded by love. Her family was out there. Mrs. Chun was out there. And most importantly, her grandmother's memory was right there with her. Sarah walked to the piano bench and sat down. She adjusted the bench height slightly and placed her hands on the keys. The auditorium was completely silent, waiting. Sarah closed her eyes for just a moment and thought about her grandmother's kitchen, filled with the smell of fresh bread and the sound of gentle humming. She thought about all the women in her family who had carried this melody through the generations. She thought about the story the music told, about life's journey from uncertainty to peace. Then Sarah opened her eyes, took a deep breath, and began to play. The first notes of Für Elise floated into the silent auditorium like a gentle question being asked of the universe. Sarah's fingers found their way to the keys as naturally as water finding its path downhill. All the fear and nervousness that had been building inside her seemed to melt away the moment she began to play. Da 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 da. The familiar opening melody filled the space around her, but something was different this time. Sarah was not just playing the notes. She had practiced for 6 weeks. She was sharing a piece of her soul with everyone in the room. As she played the gentle opening theme, Sarah felt her grandmother's presence more strongly than ever. In her mind, she could see Abuela Rosa as a young girl, full of dreams and uncertainty about what life would bring. The music seemed to carry that feeling of hopeful innocence, of a life just beginning to unfold. Sarah had been worried that the audience would find her piece too simple, too basic compared to the complex works the other students had performed. But as the melody continued, she began to sense a change in the atmosphere of the auditorium. The rustling of programs stopped. The quiet coughing and shifting in seats. Even the small children who had been restless during previous performances seemed to be listening intently. The music was working its magic, just as Mrs. Chun had said it would. The simple beauty of Beethoven's melody was reaching into the hearts of everyone in the room, regardless of their musical knowledge or experience. Sarah could feel the audience being drawn into the story she was telling. As the opening theme concluded and the music began to transition into the more dramatic middle section, Sarah thought about her grandmother's journey from Mexico to the United States. She imagined the courage it must have taken to leave everything familiar behind, the excitement and fear of starting over in a new country, the determination to build a better life for her family. The notes became more urgent, more passionate. Sarah's fingers pressed the keys with new intensity, and the piano responded with rich, full tones that seemed to fill every corner of the auditorium. This was the part of the piece that spoke of struggle and hardship, but also of strength and resilience. In the audience, Sarah's mother felt tears beginning to form in her eyes. She recognized the story her daughter was telling through the music. This was not just a performance of a classical piece. This was Sarah sharing her grandmother's life story, honoring Rosa's memory in the most beautiful way possible. Mrs. Chun, sitting in the front row with the other music teachers, felt a deep sense of satisfaction. She had known from the beginning that Sarah had something special to offer, even if Sarah herself had not believed it. Now, watching her shy student pour her heart into this performance, Mrs. Chun knew that Sarah had finally found her voice as a musician. Sarah's father, who had never considered himself particularly musical, found himself completely absorbed in his daughter's playing. He could hear the love in every note, could feel the emotion behind every phrase. This was his little girl, the same child who used to be too scared to speak up in class, now commanding the attention of 200 people with her music. As the dramatic middle section reached its climax, Sarah felt as though she was channeling not just her grandmother's story, but the stories of all the women in her family who had faced challenges with courage and grace. The music seemed to carry the weight of generations, the accumulated wisdom and strength that had been passed down through the years. Then, gradually, the intensity began to fade. The passionate phrases gave way to gentler ones, and Sarah knew she was approaching the return of the opening theme. But when the familiar melody came back, it carried new meaning. It was no longer a question about what life might bring. It was an answer about what life had brought: love, family, peace, and the quiet satisfaction of a life well lived. As Sarah played this final return of the main theme, she could almost hear her grandmother humming along. The melody seemed to fill the auditorium with the same warmth and comfort that had filled Abuela Rosa's small kitchen all those years ago. It was a sound of home, of belonging, of unconditional love. In the audience, people were having their own emotional responses to the music. An elderly man in the back row was reminded of his own grandmother, who had sung lullabies to him in a language he had long forgotten. A young mother holding her baby felt tears streaming down her cheeks as she thought about the bond between generations, about the love that gets passed down from parent to child. Two teenagers who had come reluctantly to support their friend's little sister found themselves completely absorbed in the performance. They had expected to be bored by classical music, but there was something about Sarah's playing that spoke to them directly. The music was telling a story they could understand, expressing feelings they had experienced themselves. Even the other student performers, waiting backstage for their own turns, had stopped their nervous preparations to listen. There was something magical happening on that stage, something that transcended technical skill or musical complexity. Sarah was doing what every artist dreams of doing. She was touching the hearts of her audience. As the piece moved toward its conclusion, Sarah felt a profound sense of connection, not just to her grandmother, but to every person sitting in the auditorium. The music had become a bridge between her heart and theirs, a way of sharing something beautiful and meaningful with people she might never meet or speak to directly. The final phrases of "Für Elise" flowed from Sarah's fingers with a gentleness that seemed to caress the air itself. Each note was placed with perfect care, not because Sarah was thinking about technique, but because she was thinking about love. She was thinking about her grandmother's hands, always busy but always gentle. She was thinking about her grandmother's voice, always kind and encouraging. As Sarah played the very last notes of the piece, she felt a sense of completion that went beyond simply finishing a performance. She had done what she set out to do. She had honored her grandmother's memory. She had shared a piece of her family's history with the world. She had found the courage to open her heart and let others see inside. The final note hung in the air for what seemed like an eternity. Sarah kept her hands on the keys for a moment, not wanting to break the spell that the music had created. The auditorium was completely silent, as if everyone was afraid to breathe and disturb the beauty of what they had just experienced. Then Sarah lifted her hands from the keys and looked out at the audience for the first time since she had begun playing. What she saw took her breath away. In the dim light, she could see faces throughout the auditorium, and many of them were wet with tears. People were not just politely appreciating her performance. They had been genuinely moved by it. In that moment, Sarah understood what Mrs. Chun had been trying to teach her all along. Music was not about impressing people with technical skill. It was about touching their hearts, about sharing something beautiful and meaningful, about creating connections between human beings. Sarah had worried that her simple piece would not be enough, that it would pale in comparison to the more complex works performed by her classmates. But looking out at the tear-streaked faces in the audience, she realized that she had given them something that no amount of technical complexity could provide. She had given them a piece of her heart, a window into her soul, a glimpse of the Love that connected her to her grandmother, and to all the generations that had come before. The silence in the auditorium continued for what felt like forever. Sarah sat at the piano, hardly daring to believe what had just happened. She had not just performed a piece of music. She had created a moment of pure beauty, a shared experience that would stay with everyone in that room for the rest of their lives. And in that magical silence, Sarah could almost hear her grandmother's voice one more time, filled with pride and love. "See, Mia, that's exactly how it should be played. That's how you share your heart with the world." The silence that followed Sarah's performance was unlike anything the auditorium had ever experienced. It was not the empty silence of a room waiting for something to happen. It was the full, rich silence of a room that had just witnessed something extraordinary, something that had touched the very core of human emotion. Sarah sat at the piano, her hands still poised above the keys, hardly daring to move or breathe. She could feel the weight of 200 people's attention, but it no longer frightened her. Instead, it felt like being held in a warm embrace by an entire community of people who had just shared in something beautiful. In the front row, Mrs. Chun was the first to react visibly. Tears had been streaming down her cheeks since the middle of Sarah's performance, but now she was not even trying to hide them. She had heard thousands of student performances over her 15 years of teaching, but she had never heard anything quite like what Sarah had just shared with the room. Mrs. Chun had known that Sarah had musical ability, but she had not expected this level of emotional maturity, this depth of connection to the music. Sarah had not just played for Elise. She had transformed it into something personal and universal at the same time, something that spoke to the shared human experience of love, loss, memory, and hope. Sitting 3 rows back, Sarah's parents were holding hands and crying openly. Sarah's mother had brought tissues in her purse, knowing she might get emotional watching her daughter perform, but she had not expected to be this overwhelmed. She had watched Sarah grow from a shy little girl who was afraid of her own shadow into a young woman who could move an entire auditorium to tears with her music. Sarah's father, who had always struggled to understand his daughter's love of piano, finally got it. He finally understood why Sarah spent so many hours practicing, why music was so important to her. It was not just about playing notes correctly. It was about communicating something that words could not express. It was about sharing the deepest parts of yourself with others. Throughout the auditorium, similar scenes were playing out. An elderly woman in the 4th row was reminded so strongly of her own mother that she felt as though she could smell her mother's perfume and hear her voice. A middle-aged man who had been reluctantly dragged to the recital by his wife found himself thinking about his own grandmother, who had died when he was Sarah's age. He had not thought about her in years, but Sarah's music had brought those memories flooding back. Near the back of the auditorium, a teenage boy who played in a rock band was experiencing a complete shift in his understanding of classical music. He had always thought of it as boring and outdated, but what Sarah had just played was neither of those things. It was alive and relevant and deeply moving. It made him want to learn more about classical music, to understand how simple melodies could carry such emotional power. The silence stretched on for what felt like hours, but was probably only 30 seconds. Then, from somewhere in the middle of the auditorium, came the sound of a single pair of hands clapping. The applause was slow and deliberate, the kind of clapping that comes from deep appreciation rather than polite obligation. Within seconds, other hands joined in. The applause grew louder and more enthusiastic as more and more people began to clap. But this was not the usual polite applause that followed most student performances. This was something deeper, more heartfelt, more genuine, and then something extraordinary happened. Mrs. Chun stood up. She was still crying, but she was smiling too, and she began to clap with more enthusiasm than Sarah had ever seen from her reserved teacher. Seeing Mrs. Chen stand, other people in the front rows began to stand as well. The standing ovation spread through the auditorium like a wave. Row by row, people rose to their feet, clapping and crying and smiling all at the same time. Sarah's parents were among the first to stand, their faces shining with pride and joy. Soon, the entire auditorium was on its feet, giving Sarah the kind of standing ovation usually reserved for professional performers at the end of major concerts. Sarah sat at the piano, stunned. She had never in her wildest dreams imagined that her simple performance of Für Elise could provoke this kind of response. She had worried that people would think her piece was too basic, too elementary. Instead, they were giving her the most enthusiastic applause of the entire evening. The standing ovation continued for what felt like an eternity. People were not just clapping politely and then sitting down. They were continuing to stand, continuing to applaud, many of them still wiping tears from their eyes. Some people were calling out words of encouragement. Beautiful! Wonderful! Bravo! Sarah finally stood up from the piano bench and turned to face the audience properly. When she saw all those people on their feet, all those faces looking at her with such warmth and appreciation, she felt overwhelmed with emotion. Tears began to stream down her own cheeks as she realized what had just happened. She had done it. She had actually done it. She had performed in front of 200 people, and not only had she not embarrassed herself, she had moved them to tears. She had shared her grandmother's memory with the world, and the world had received it with open hearts. Sarah attempted a small curtsy, the way she had seen performers do in videos, but her legs were shaking so much that she nearly lost her balance. The audience found this endearing rather than awkward, and the applause grew even louder. People were laughing and crying at the same time, caught up in the joy of the moment. From the wings of the stage, the other student performers were watching in amazement. They had all worked hard on their pieces, and many of them had performed more technically challenging music than Sarah, but none of them had received this kind of response from the audience. They were witnessing something special, something that would be talked about for years to come. Jessica, who had sung a difficult aria with perfect technique, found herself genuinely happy for Sarah rather than jealous. She understood that what Sarah had accomplished was different from technical perfection. Sarah had touched people's hearts in a way that went beyond musical skill. David, who had played a complex guitar arrangement, was rethinking his own approach to music. He had focused so much on impressing people with his technical ability that he had forgotten about the emotional side of performance. Watching Sarah's triumph, he realized that maybe the most important thing was not how difficult your music was, but how much feeling you put into it. The standing ovation seemed to go on forever. Sarah stood on the stage, tears streaming down, her face looking out at all those people who had been touched by her music. She thought about her grandmother, and she knew that Abuela Rosa would have been so proud. Not just proud of Sarah's musical ability, but proud of her courage, her willingness to open her heart and share something precious with others. Finally, after what must have been at least 2 minutes of continuous applause, the audience began to settle down. People slowly returned to their seats, but the energy in the room remained electric. Sarah walked off the stage on shaking legs, hardly able to believe what had just happened. As soon as she reached the wings, Mrs. Chun was there, waiting for her with a huge smile and more tears in her eyes. "Sarah, that was absolutely beautiful," Mrs. Chun said, pulling her into a warm hug. "I have never heard you play with so much feeling, so much heart. Your grandmother would have been so proud." "I felt her with me," Sarah said through her tears. "I felt her right there beside me the whole time." "I'm sure she was," Mrs. Chun said. "And I'm sure she'll be with you every time you play from now on." Other people began to surround Sarah, offering congratulations and praise. Fellow students, teachers, parents of other performers, they all wanted to tell her how moved they had been by her performance. Many of them had tears in their eyes as they spoke to her. "That was the most beautiful thing I've ever heard," said one woman whose own daughter had performed earlier in the evening. "You made me think about my own grandmother and all the love she gave me. Thank you for that gift." An elderly man shook Sarah's hand and told her, "I've been to many professional concerts in my life, but I have never been moved the way I was tonight. You have a special gift, young lady. Not just for playing music, but for sharing your heart." Sarah's parents finally made their way backstage through the crowd of well-wishers. Her mother wrapped her in the biggest hug of her life, both of them crying and laughing at the same time. Mia, that was incredible, her father said, using her grandmother's term of endearment. I felt like Abuela Rosa was right there in the room with us. I could almost hear her humming along. I know she was there, Sarah said with certainty. I've never felt so connected to her as I did tonight. As the crowd around Sarah gradually dispersed and the other students continued with their performances, Sarah found a quiet corner backstage to collect herself. She was still shaking with adrenaline and emotion, still hardly able to believe what had just happened. Mrs. Chun found her there a few minutes later, sitting quietly with a look of wonder on her face. How are you feeling? Mrs. Chun asked gently. Different, Sarah said honestly. I feel like something has changed inside me. I never knew I could do that. I never knew I could make people feel so much just by playing piano. You've discovered something very important tonight.